Hi, I'm Father Chris Ryan. I'm a priest of the Missionaries of God's Love. And amongst the different things I do, youth ministry remains a really important passion of my life. And I wanted to share with you today a little bit about some of the things that I think are most important when it comes to evangelising young people, helping them to encounter the person of Christ and become missionary disciples, as Pope Francis speaks of all our vocations, that we're all called to be missionary disciples. It's not so long ago that I think that people had the idea that a one-sized youth group fit everybody, that no matter where you were on the journey of faith, you would actually find if you were a young person of a certain age, you'd join the youth group and the youth group would meet your needs. And in an earlier time, that was probably largely true. The people who joined our youth groups, even if they weren't maybe always at church, their parents were, and then they'd be with their friends who perhaps were at Mass on Sundays. And so it was a fairly homogenous kind of group, a fairly similar sort of group of people. And they're at maybe a similar sort of level of understanding about faith, a similar level of approach and belief, attitudes to faith perhaps. And so you could, as a youth minister, you could say, okay, well, this is what we need to do. But if we're actually really trying to invite and draw people today from all stages and all walks of life into an encounter with Christ, young people today aren't all in the one place in relation to faith. They're not all in the one spot. And so what we need to be much more attentive to is that there are different stages in the journey that we need to apply to youth ministry if we're going to be effective in the ministry that we do with young people. So the way that I like to think about this actually comes from the teaching of the church. It may surprise you to think that there's a lot of actual official teaching about youth ministry. Christus Vivit is the most obvious example of that, where Pope Francis has an apostolic exhortation on young people, faith and discernment. But I think that there's actually another body of teaching that we can draw upon and apply to youth ministry that's really, really helpful for us. And that goes actually all the way back to the Second Vatican Council, back to the 1960s. There's a document there called Ad Gentes from Vatican II, which outlines a process of evangelisation that subsequent popes talked about as well. Paul VI, John Paul II, Pope Benedict refers to it, and then Pope Francis as well. And so this process actually tells us something about how someone can move from being a person who isn't interested in God, doesn't believe perhaps, we might say is an atheist or is indifferent to the things of God, not involved in the church in any way, that they might go on a journey through to the point where they're actually engaged followers of Jesus. They're missionary disciples. They're following Christ wholeheartedly because Jesus has really become the very center of their lives. How do we move people from point A to point B? This document, Ad Gentes, and the documents that follow give us a clue. They give us a really helpful way of seeing that, of understanding it. And so I want to just walk you through some key steps there. In its simplest form, there's really two parts. The first part we might call evangelisation, which is really helping those who haven't yet encountered the person of Jesus to come to an initial experience of him, an initial encounter where they meet him and get a taste of God's love for them through the gift of the Holy Spirit that is poured out into our hearts. The second stage is a formation stage. It's a stage or a process of deepening and developing in that initial conversion. Of course, the way this process works with adults is it's called the RCIA, the Rite of Christian Initiation of Adults. And it's this process of evangelisation that we want to apply now to youth ministry, to apply to what we would do with young people. And so the first step of that in that evangelisation process is what we might call witness. And that's the recognition that our lives as Christians, our lives as youth ministers, and not just as individuals, but our life as a community of faith, whatever that community looks like, should actually speak to people around us. There should be something different about us as Christians. There should be, our joy should be noticeable. Because we've encountered the love that God has for us, there should be a joy in our lives that, as Pope Francis says, is independent of our personal circumstances. Christian joy doesn't depend upon whether you're having a great day or not. It depends upon the truth that God loves you all the time. And when we know that, and when we're seeking to live a life that flows out of that knowledge, then our lives should be marked by a joy, by a trust, by a confidence as we face the future, even if that future looks challenging in some way or form, that actually it provokes questions that people around us, people that we're friends with, the young people that we're trying to reach out to, actually might find themselves saying, what is it about this person? Why are they different? When they've faced troubles and trials, when they've engaged in struggles of one sort or another, they've done that in a way that I actually think has been really helpful for me as I've watched. Or when I've gone through something, they've been able to meet me there with patience and care and above all love. That's the witness that we want people to have. That's the witness of our lives that would invite questions amongst the young people that we're ministering to and reaching out to, where they might find themselves saying, what is it that makes them tick? Why are they the way that they are? And it's only really when people are asking those sorts of questions that they're really in a position to actually be engaged in a real dialogue. Until that point, anything that we do is going to feel like we're forcing something upon them, that we're imposing something from without into their lives, that we're saying to them, you should believe this, or you should believe that, or the church says this, or the church says that. It's only once people have actually experienced the witness of our life, the way we live, the way we treat them, the way we particularly care for those who are suffering or hurting, that they actually find themselves then saying, okay, I'm now curious, intrigued, and I want to find out more. And that's the opportunity for a real dialogue. Not an opportunity, I think, for us to just tell them something. So often people, with the best of intentions in ministry, tell people the answers to questions that those people haven't asked. I remember the story that Henri Nouwen tells, which is the story of, it's actually a children's classroom. And the teacher says to the class, kids, who invented the steam engine? Nobody answers anything for a while. And then wearily, one little 7-year-old boy puts up his hand and says, oh, miss, is it Jesus again? That's where there's too many questions being answered that people haven't asked. Feeling like the answer to everything is Jesus before somebody's really ready to actually be probing and looking for a response to questions about the meaning of life, the existence of God, and who is the person of Jesus. But once people have responded to that witness, they do become a little curious. And it's an opportunity for us then to really pay attention and listen to them. I want to stress here that I think the initiative begins with the young person that we're trying to reach out to, not with us. It's not at this stage that we've got so much a story to tell, but we want to respond to the questions that they have. We want to listen really well, and we want to try and answer the questions or meet them in the searching that they're undergoing at that time. And those questions could be all sorts of things. At that stage in the journey, young people are often thinking, can I really believe this stuff? Like, do sensible people really believe this? Isn't a sign of maturity that you've actually chucked away all this childish religious stuff? Isn't that just superstition? They might find themselves saying, look, I really love science. I really believe in what science has to offer. That's trustworthy. You can't trust whether a religion's true or not. Look at how many religions there are, and people believe all these things. Science is much more satisfactory. It's safer. You can't possibly believe in something that you can't empirically prove or demonstrate. So we want to be able to respond to those questions, but it's a response to the questions that they actually have. And as we do that, what we're actually doing, and I think this is really a helpful way of thinking about it, is we're trying to remove some of the roadblocks or obstacles. We're not trying to make them have faith. We're not trying to tell them what they need to believe at this point. What we're actually just doing is recognizing that here are some things that could get in the way of their faith or their coming to faith. And we want to just help them to be able to move them so that there's a clearer path, if you like, for them to be able to receive what God would want to bring to them at the appropriate moment or time. This all takes time. And there's something here about really being patient ministers, that we can't actually jump too quickly into trying to solve people's questions, that we need to patiently accompany them. Often this feels like a 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of thing. We need to recognize that a young person's never a project. They're never somebody that we're kind of working on for the sake of the gospel. They're a young person made in the image and likeness of God, and we want to meet them with love, regardless of what response they might make now, today, or tomorrow, or in 10 years' time about faith. We want to love them just because Jesus wants us to love them, not because they're a project for us to work on, a recruit to kind of find. They're a young person who needs to discover and encounter the love of God for themselves. So that process can all take some time. At some point, it's really important then that they do have an opportunity to hear the Kerygma. So part of this first stage is really helping a young person or young people to understand the foundational story of Christian faith. Quite simply, the Kerygma is the initial proclamation of the gospel. It's that moment where we talk about what God has done for us in Jesus, and especially in his death and resurrection and through the gift of his Spirit. There are all sorts of different ways of describing that and of naming that, but fundamentally it's that Jesus died on the cross to bring us forgiveness, and he rose from the dead in order to bring us into communion with God, into a relationship of love with the triune God. And that's something that happens in and through Jesus' death and resurrection, and it becomes real and tangible and personal for us through the gift of the Holy Spirit. That when we receive the Holy Spirit into our lives, Jesus isn't just a historical figure who lived 2,000 years ago, and that his death and resurrection is something that happened way back when, but it's actually that while the death and resurrection of Jesus did happen in history, their saving effects are present to us now. And so when somebody hears the Kerygma, they hear that initial proclamation of the gospel, and they hear that while it's true for all of humanity, everyone who's ever lived before, everyone who's lived before this moment, everyone alive right now, everyone living out into the future, it's true for every person. But part of the proclamation of the gospel is that I'm given the opportunity to discover that it's true for me. It's true in my life. That this is the truth, the deepest truth of my life, that Jesus died for me, that he rose from the dead in order to bring me into communion with God. And that touches me deeply, personally, at the most intimate part of myself. So it's so important that our efforts to evangelize include this initial proclamation of the gospel. Without it, young people can come and they can love the things that we put on, the events that we do, the various activities that they're part of. They can love those things. They can really enjoy the sense of relationship and connection that they might receive from other young people, from leaders. And that's all good. None of that's a bad thing. But they won't come to a deeper faith. They won't come to a real, genuine faith unless they've been given the opportunity to respond to the Kerygma. So we've got to tell them that story when the time's right. Do it too prematurely and they'll run a mile. But we run a bigger risk in the church, I think, is that we actually don't tell that story, that we assume that people know it. We assume that they understand it rather than explaining it to them as simply as we can and offering them the opportunity to respond to that message. The response that young people are invited to make there, and all people of course, but young people are invited to make, is a response of faith. A response of faith and a response of conversion. And I just want to say just a couple of things about that. There's so much more that we could say. But the response of faith, we sometimes think about faith as things that we need to believe, as a whole bunch of ideas or concepts that we need to understand, doctrines that we need to hold on to. And there is an intellectual dimension to faith. The church has a rich intellectual tradition, and there's a whole way of understanding what we believe. And it's really important that we do talk about that with young people and help them to discover the rich intellectual foundation of our faith, that we help them discover a language for expressing the ultimately inexpressible, the mystery of God made one of us in Jesus. However, it's possible to have all the ideas, but you not actually have a faith that is living in the sense that it actually changes my life, that it actually becomes my compass, if you like, the way in which I make choices in my life, the priorities I give to the things that matter in life. That kind of faith we might speak of as a kind of allegiance. It's almost like I'm saying, well, Jesus is my King, he's my Lord, and I'm allying myself to him. He has my allegiance, I'm committed to him, and I'm joining with him in what he's doing in the world. When I do that, it's a different thing. It's not just that I'm saying yes to some ideas, but I'm actually saying my life belongs to him. That's a different dimension of faith, and it's really crucial at the beginning of the faith journey, but then it also must continue throughout our lives. When we speak of conversion, we often think about that's a turning away from something. When I convert, I'm saying no to something. And that's absolutely true. I'm saying no to all that is not of God, and I'm saying yes to the God that's revealed in Jesus. And we often think about that primarily in moral terms, that a young person becomes aware that they've got a pattern of sinful behavior. They've got habits that don't actually lead them to life, habits that don't actually make for their full human flourishing. And they do need to leave those behind in order to follow Jesus. And so there is a turning away, a conversion from those things as they respond to the gospel. But there's also a yes to a new way of life, to living a life that where we are seeking not only to follow Jesus with our mind, but also with our actions, that we're actually wanting to be more virtuous people, wanting to be people who really will follow him with our lives and our hearts. The other part of that conversion, though, is that it's really about every part of who I am. My emotions are changed and transformed. I experience healing as I discover a deeper life with God. It's also that I become much more aware to the plight of those who are suffering and hurting, and that I really I develop a heart for the poor. Conversion actually affects every part of who I am. It's saying no to everything that doesn't lead to life, not just morally, but in the way that I think about things, myself, the world, God, and saying yes to God's mind, if you like, God's intention for us as human beings. It affects our emotions, it affects our actions. Every part of us is changed by that encounter with Jesus. When someone's had that initial encounter and they've made an initial response where they've encountered the person of Jesus as a response to the Kerygma, and they've gone, wow, Jesus is real, he's alive, he loves me. And they start to get a sense of, that you can see that they're starting to awaken to faith. That's when they're ready for stage 2 in the process. We call that formation. In the RCIA, this is called the catechumenate. This is the process of deepening in that initial conversion. It's growing in our understanding, but before we sort of focus on the understanding, it's really, I like to think of it as about an apprenticeship. So what we're trying to do with young people is we want them to actually experience the life of faith in our community. We want them to experience really genuine relationship, a deep sense of belonging, a deep sense that they're part of our faith community, connected, loved, respected. We also want them to also enjoy and learn and discover what it's like to pray with us. We also want them to discover what it's like to be in mission with us as well, that we draw them into ministry, engage them in mission. And it's those three things, it's sharing in the life of our community, deepening in prayer, and deepening in our ministry and mission, that are really going to work like an apprenticeship or an on-the-job training in the way of Christian life. What this really stresses is that Christianity is less of a belief system. We obviously do have beliefs and doctrines that we need to say yes to, but it's much more a way of life. And we want young people to experience it as a way of life. And they do that by watching us, living with us, sharing our life, our prayer, our ministry. There is also a place for catechesis. There's a place for teaching and instruction about what we believe. But that's most effective when it's bouncing off young people's lived experience of the church, of our community of faith. So one of the big challenges for us is to make sure that our communities, our parishes, our youth ministries, our communities are places where young people experience that sense of belonging before they necessarily believe, that deep place of belonging, a deep sense of connection and community, and that they do actually learn to pray by praying with us, and they learn ministry by ministering alongside of us. That's the deepest way that formation can happen, and then with some reflection upon that experience through catechesis. All too often, I think in youth ministry, we get that round the wrong way, and we actually focus much more on what's the talk I'm going to give, what's the content that I want to impart. That has its place. But what's more primary is that they're living our way of life, experiencing it. If we think about the RCIA, it culminates when people are baptized. When they are baptized, usually at the Easter Vigil, and they are also confirmed and they receive the Eucharist for the first time. Some of our young people in youth ministry will go through that process. They'll actually be in the catechumenate. They will be baptized at Easter Vigils if we're really reaching out to those who not only aren't churched but have never been part of our community of faith were never baptized. But of course, our youth ministries will have young people who are the children of practicing parents, who have grown up in church, as it were, and they need to go through this same process as well, okay? And also there will be those who maybe they've been invited by their friends who were baptized as infants, but maybe haven't been involved in church, haven't experienced that, haven't grown up going to Mass, and they've got to go through this process too. The big difference is about where they stand in relation to baptism, but the same process of evangelization and formation applies to all young people. We just need to make sure then that our youth groups, our youth ministries have structures and events and a real plan, a real pathway, if you like, that provides a context for people to be evangelized and for young people then to grow and deepen, to be formed more fully in that initial, so that they grow beyond that initial encounter into ongoing communion with God. What I love about this process is, first and foremost, is I can see it, how it worked in my life. That as a 16-year-old kid who'd grown up in a Catholic family, who'd gone to church on Sundays, I needed to encounter Jesus for myself. It wasn't enough that I experienced the faith of my parents. I needed to actually make it my own. And I needed to hear the gospel. I needed to encounter people who witnessed to me that it was possible to know Jesus personally. I needed to discover that there was more to faith than I'd first realized. And then I needed to hear people tell me about what God has done for us in Jesus. And then once that happened, you couldn't keep me away. Like, I wanted to learn, I wanted to grow, I loved doing ministry. I started showing up and being involved in the youth ministry, becoming a leader. And in and through that process, I was deeply formed, and I grew in my faith, grew in my passion, and ultimately discovered my vocation. So I love the process of evangelization because it makes sense of my actual experience, and it makes sense of the experience that I've seen in hundreds, maybe thousands of young people that we've reached out to and ministered to over many years now. This process actually works. If we follow this process, if we're attentive to it, we see young people being given the opportunity to respond to the gospel, to the person of Jesus. Obviously, they can say no. Obviously, people can say yes, and they can not necessarily continue on that journey. But without some kind of clear framework like this that tells us what we should be trying to do at each moment in someone's journey, how we can be meeting them along the journey of faith, then I think we're kind of shooting blind. I think we're wandering around trying to do something in youth ministry that will grab people, capture their attention, when what we really need to be thinking about is, where are they on that journey, and how can I meet them patiently with love and respect there and invite them to take yet another step. I love the process of evangelization because I think it's actually true to how people come to faith, and especially how young people come to know and encounter God.